This week on Writers, Inc.
Those were learning curves for me. And it's very possible for somebody to just hit it out of the park with a debut novel. But, it's just like anything else. I mean, if you decide you want to build a house, you're not going to go down to Home Depot and buy a couple 2x4s and get it right the first time out of the gate. You've got to practice a little bit. And writing is no different.
Whether you are traditionally published or indie, writing a good book is only the first step in becoming a successful author. The days of just turning a manuscript into your editor and walking away are gone. If you want to succeed in today's publishing world, you need to understand every aspect of the business: editing, formatting, marketing, contracts. It all starts with a good book. Then the real work begins. Join international best-selling author J.D. Barker and indie powerhouse Jay Thorne as they gain unique insight and valuable advice from the most prolific and accomplished authors in the business. The publishing world is changing, adapting. Do you have what it takes to become a full-time writer? If you're willing to do the work, we'll give you the tools. Get your notepad out. School's in session. This is Writers Inc.
All right, welcome to episode number 1 of the Writers Inc. podcast. I am Jay Thorne along here with JD Barker. What's up, JD?
I'm doing good. How are you?
This is excellent, man. This is our first official episode of the Writers Inc. podcast, and I think we're both pretty excited to be here.
Episode 1. I listen to so many different podcasts, and they're at, this is episode 500. This is episode 400. Episode 1. That's a little daunting, but, hopefully one day we'll look back on it and we'll be a couple hundred episodes in.
I sure hope so. I mean, it's they go by quickly. That's what's great about podcasting. It's very similar to writing. If you just do a little bit consistently and you look back and you're shocked at how much you've accomplished. And I think podcasting is a parallel there for writing. So this is pretty exciting.
Cool. Well, this is the first time I've ever been on as any form of a host or co-party or co-host or whatever we want to call it. I've always been the person getting interviewed. So this is a first for me. I'm curious to see how it's going to play out. Yeah,
I'm excited for it. Although I am going to kind of put you back into the interviewee seat for this particular episode, because I thought, I've had several podcasts over a number of years, and I really enjoy sort of listening to other people's stories and learning from them. And I thought, because you're a co-host on this, we should probably start with you and get to know you a little bit and sort of your journey. But rather than sort of asking you to go all the way back to your birth and work your way up, I thought maybe we could change it up a little bit. And maybe we could start by you telling us what you're working on right now.
Well, I just figured out how to do what I consider to be impossible. I'm writing 2 different books at the same time. So I'm writing one book in the morning, then I stop and have lunch, and I literally switch hats and I jump into a totally different story. And it's partly because from a pacing standpoint, I tend to write a lot. I do about 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. I do this full time now, so I get up first thing in the morning, and as soon as the coffee IV line goes in, I just start churning out the words. But I find that with any particular story I'm working on, if I get to like maybe 1,500 words or so, then it starts to, like, the pacing tends to slow down a little bit. And I like to have quick, short chapters, fast pacing, no dull moments at all. So I'm finding that if I jump between multiple stories, I can do that with multiple stories. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I've got a couple contracts that I have to satisfy, and, I figure, well, why not knock them out in 3 months instead of 6?
Right. What is your goal when you sit down for a session? You said 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. If you're working on 2 projects, does that mean you're doubling your word count, or are you splitting that total?
No, I'm splitting it up. I try to keep my scenes between 1,000 and 1,500 words. So I'll usually, if I hit 1,500 or so on the first book, then I'll take a break and grab something to eat, and then I jump into the second book. But usually around 3,000 words total for the day. I find that, writing is weird. It's kind of like a muscle. If you're working a full-time job and you're still trying to get that first novel done, if you can come home every night and kick out 100 or 200 or even 300 words, that's a page a day. I mean, you've got a novel in a year, as long as you can do that. But it is a lot like a muscle. If you get used to doing 300 words, the next day you come in, you do 400 words. And before you know it, 400 is pretty easy. And then you're shooting for 500, and then you're shooting for 700. And, that's kind of how I work myself up to my current level. But I do find, just like working out, it goes away just as fast. If I take a vacation or I go to a conference or something, if I'm not writing every single day, then when I finally do get my butt back in my chair, it's like squeezing water out of a rock again. And you kind of have to work your way back up to that. So I'm, by doing this 2 books at the same time and keeping my pacing up, like it's becoming easier and easier as I go. And I tend to, we're going to give out a lot of advice on this podcast. That's kind of the goal. And I tend to reach to a lot of the publishing stars of today's world to get that advice. Like I'll email Stephen King, I'll email Dean Koontz. I'm co-authoring a book right now with James Patterson. So those are the kind of guys that I go to for advice because they've done it. They've been through this, from start to finish. Koontz told me that he had 15 books out there before he had a bestseller. Yeah. And his first bestseller was the first time that he ever worked without an outline, where he worked as a pantser. And like little tidbits of information like that, it's so helpful. And God knows I stumbled along the way trying to figure things out. So the point of this is just to try and help people, not stumble over some of those same hurdles anymore that I did or that you did, and, hopefully get them past it.
So how do you figure out which advice to implement and which advice is not really going to work for you?
Well, I kind of take a consensus view. Like we'll take the pantsing versus outlining thing, because that's always a big topic. I've worked from an outline. Like when I worked with Patterson on the first book, we sat down and we had lunch down in Florida. And he had read The Fourth Monkey, which was my second novel. And he gave me a great blurb for it. And he's like, this is going to get you a seat at the big kids table. This is a solid book. And he just to hear all that stuff was just crazy, coming out of James Patterson's mouth. But then, we started talking about writing a book together, and he told me that he works exclusively with outlines. He doesn't work without them, and it keeps him efficient, keeps him moving fast. And I told him that I've never worked with an outline. I've always pantsed it. Like in my mind, I come up with my characters and I get them to the point where they're as real as anybody else, as real as my next door neighbor. And then I drop them into a particular scenario and I just let it play out, and all the, everything seems to land in the right boxes by the time I hit that last page. But when I'm writing at the beginning, I've got no idea how these stories are going to end. And he's the opposite. And I told him I didn't think I could work from an outline. And I actually talked him into writing a book without an outline. The first time he's done that since probably Along Came a Spider, since his early books. And he had a lot of fun with it. I think it kind of refreshed the process for him. It was something new. And at the same time that we started talking about working on something together with an outline, and he's kind of, brought me around a little bit to that, because it can speed up the process. It makes things a lot easier. I'll write my last book. I think it ended up around 207,000 words. Then about 50 or 60,000 words ended up on the cutting room floor to get the novel tight. And when you follow a process like what he lays out, that doesn't happen. Yeah. You don't waste words. Every word counts. And, so I'm trying to find a sweet spot somewhere in between. Koontz told me that he sits down every day and he reads what he wrote the previous day and he edits that and he fine tunes it, gets it perfect. And then, an hour or so into it, then he starts working on new words. He just continues the story. And the next day he sits down and he reads what he wrote the previous day. It just keeps going that way. And his word count is insane. He puts me to shame. But when he's done, like he's basically got a finished novel. There's no second or third draft anymore. He hits the end at the end of that book and, it's done. It's polished and it goes off to his editor. And the ones that I've seen from him at that stage are flawless. There's no typos. There's no copy problem or copy edit problems. I mean, it's insane, but like that, that's what I want to strive for. I create that or find that brass ring through one of these guys. They teach me a little something and I hang it above my head and say, okay, that's where I'm going to try and grab. I'm going to try and do that. And each time I hope that it makes my own writing a little bit better.
That's fascinating because you hear sort of these very, I did anyways, these very distinct, disparate methods from writers who are incredibly successful. And I know that you've done a lot of decades of book doctoring and coaching. So when you encounter, say, someone who's relatively new to writing, you have this whole spectrum of advice that you've both lived and gotten. What do you tell the person who's coming very new to the page?
Well, I see a lot of, and I still mentor people because when I started getting published, I missed that. I missed the feedback of working with somebody new and helping them, fine tune their writing and get to the point where they get published. So I still take on students and mentor, but I see a lot of the same problems. Passive voice is always huge. In everything, showing versus telling, it's the same problems repeated over and over again. And you've probably heard this before, but most authors have to write anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million words before they actually find their real voice.
Yes.
And I'm no different. I mean, I've got 2 or 3 novels on my computer that are never going to see the light of day. Unless my daughter finds them after I'm dead and pulls a Tom Clancy on me and gets them out there.
That could happen.
It could happen. But those were learning curves for me. And it's very possible for somebody to just hit it out of the park with a debut novel. But, it's just like anything else. I mean, if you decide you want to build a house, you're not going to go down to Home Depot and buy a couple 2x4s and get it right the first time out of the gate. You've got to practice a little bit. And writing is no different.
So do you counsel young writers or inexperienced writers to start with an outline or to start with some characters and an idea and just roll with it?
Well, that's the thing. And I learned when working as a book doctor, you kind of have to figure out what works for each individual, because some people, their brains don't work that way. Like you can tell them to outline and they'll create an outline, but then they'll write, the first chapter and then they start drifting off into the weeds. Yeah. And the outline is off to the side somewhere. And, I kind of liken, I try to feel them out, figure out what I think is going to work for them. And for me personally, like I don't outline, but I do create a beginning and a middle and an end. Like I've got those are in mind. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's, the ending that I've got when I start the book is going to be the ending that I'll actually end up with. But it gives me a destination. It's no different than driving from like New York to California. You're going to end up in LA.
Yeah.
So it's okay if you take a detour and you stop here and you stop there, as long as you get back on that highway and you know where you're going to finally end up. So I try to feel out where people are. And some people are very organized and they have to have an outline and they will follow it. But you have to be careful with that too, because there's plenty of people that, in published authors, New York Times bestsellers, they use outlines, and I can tell, as soon as I read that first chapter, like I can feel the formula, like clicking away with each beat of the story. And that's no fun either. I think it was Stephen King. A lot of the advice that I got initially came from his book on writing.
Right.
It's a phenomenal novel. There's two books that are sitting on my desk at any given time. I've got On Writing and I've got Strunk and White's grammar book. It's basically all you really need. But he had pointed out that if he doesn't know where the story is going, the reader's not going to figure it out. And I think that's key. I think our subconscious picks up on an outline. They see that structure, or where our brains see the structure, even if our conscious mind doesn't. And it takes a little something away from the story. But I again, just to get back to your initial question, because I'm going off in the weeds now. I just kind of figure out where everybody's at. So like I wrote Dracul with Dacre Stoker. He's Bram Stoker's great grandnephew. And he came to the table and we wanted to write a prequel to Dracula. But he didn't know where we were going to go with the story, and I wasn't sure either. And then he threw two facts out there to me. He told me that, well, first Bram wanted to publish Dracula as a true story. Like he presented it that way. And his publisher basically pushed it across the desk to him and said, no way, we're not going to do that. We need to make some changes. And they turned it into a work of fiction. And in doing that, they cut out the first 102 pages of the book. So he sprung those two facts on me, and that was enough to rope me into wanting to write the story. But then he went on to tell me that, he used to be a history teacher. And he gave me some of his writing samples, and, he can write, but it's very dry. It reads as nonfiction, as if he's writing a textbook. And he knows that. And we joke around about it. We told our agent when we first brought this book to her, Kristen Nelson, I told her, well, if Dacre were to sit down and have to write out a recipe to bake a cake, it would be extremely detailed. You would get every single step, everything that you need to get that cake, and it would be perfect. If you gave me that same recipe, I would probably tweak it a little bit, and you would end up racing to the grocery store to buy everything. You'd probably double park in front. You'd run through the aisles, grabbing things off the shelves. You'd forget to pay on your way out, and you'd be in your car hyperventilating, trying to figure out what just happened. Same recipe, we both end up with the same cake, but we get there in two different ways. So we quickly realized with working with him that he was great when it came to providing factual data. Like if I needed to know what Bram Stoker's bedroom looked like when he was 6 years old, he could tell me. If I needed information on his brothers and sisters, he could tell me. So he became a sounding board for information, and providing facts and research and things like that. And then I did the writing. With other people, it's been a back and forth. I write a chapter, they write a chapter. We just volley back and forth. So you just have to figure out where everybody's comfort zone is. Yeah.
That's a great transition. You mentioned your agent, and one of the reasons I've been sort of a fanboy of yours for a long time is you've lived in both of what a lot of writers consider to be two different worlds, which is the independent publishing world and the traditionally published world. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about what space you occupy there and how you got there.
Half the time I'm not even sure. So it started with my first book. My first book is called Forsaken. It's a full-on horror novel. And in the story, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. So just to get to that last page and get it down on paper, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there. Fully expected to have to change that because you can't just do that without a bunch of lawyers jumping down your throat and pounding on your door. But my wife read it. She said, no, I like this. I think we should just get his permission to use it. I said, well, how do you get Stephen King's permission to do much of anything? Turns out all I had to do was ask. We had a mutual friend, and he gave me Steve's email address, and I sent him the book, and I got an email back. He said, absolutely love this. Go ahead and use it. Let me know if you need anything. So this was before I had an agent or anything like that. So I'm staring at this email, and I thought I had it made because now I've got a book that I know is good.
Right.
I've got Stephen King's blessing to use some of his characters in there. How hard could it possibly be to get an agent? So I sent out a query letter to 200 of them. I used a form letter. Don't ever use a form letter to query agents. Again, this was a mistake that I made. I didn't know any better. I Googled, query letters online. I found a template that I liked, and I just shot it out to everybody. I didn't pay attention.
You sent 200 out?
200. I didn't pay attention to any of their requirements, as far as formatting, how many pages they wanted to see. Everybody got the same thing. Everybody got the same message. They were lucky that I even put their name in the email. It was such a blanket thing. And I got some responses back, and I got a couple of offers, but nothing that made it worthwhile to me. So I ended up self-publishing the book. But I knew that if I was going to do that, and this has been key for me from the beginning, I knew if I was going to put the book out myself, it needed to be something on par with a book coming out of like Random House, coming out of one of the top 5. If I couldn't self-publish in a way that was, you couldn't tell the difference between the two, I wouldn't do it. So I hired professionals across the board, cover designers, formatters, proofreaders, copy editors, and put this book through the ringers, before it came out. And it ended up selling really well. I ended up selling about 250,000 copies, which was enough to make me a decent chunk of change.
And when was this? What year approximately?
November 2014.
2014.
When it came out. So we were a couple of years into Kindle. And I did well with it. And at the time I was writing The Fourth Monkey, my second book. And I finished it. And, I kind of intended to self-publish that one too. Because, the finances they're better. I mean, to be honest with you, you get a 70 cent payout or 70% payout versus, roughly 25 cents on the dollar if you go through to the traditional route. You've got full control over everything if you're willing to take that on. A lot of people don't want to, but
right.
I don't like having to answer to other people, so that the fact that I could make money doing that and not have to deal with all those other headaches that I was aware of because I've got so many friends in the industry and I hear about these nightmares all the time. I figured, okay, I'll self-publish it. But my wife, again, way smarter than me. She goes, well, just do this. Just query a couple of agents, a couple of the ones that you really like, and see what happens. And if you don't get the results you want, you can always self-publish a month or two later. So I said, okay. So I reached out to Josh Mallerman. We had known each other because we were both up for the Bram Stoker Award for debut novel. He had Bird Box and I had Forsaken. And I told him that I was going to hunt for an agent. And he started telling me about Kristen Nelson, who is phenomenal. And she's kind of a dark horse. There's a website out there. Oh God, now the name escapes me, but you can a publisher's marketplace. You can research the stats on an agent, just like a baseball card. You can look them up and you can see what kind of deals they're getting, who their authors are, how much money they're basically bringing in. And I started checking, various agents and using that as as my sounding board. And I realized that she was like a dark horse. She worked out of Colorado. She's not in New York. But virtually all of her authors were New York Times bestsellers or well on their way to getting there. And she had started with all of them from the get-go. Yeah. And she had done some phenomenal deals. For like Hugh Howey, she was able to negotiate a deal where he kept his ebook rights and she sold his print rights. Things like that, like cutting edge kind of stuff. So I reached out to her and we had a great conversation. I sent her The Fourth Monkey. She got back to me and she's like, I absolutely love this, but it's a thriller. I don't represent thriller authors. So we kind of parted ways and I went ahead and I queried. I had 53 agents that I had narrowed down my list to. So I sent out a new query. This time I did personalize it. I did check to see what they were actually looking for. But I queried 53 of them and offers started coming in. I ended up with 13 offers of representation in about 2 weeks. I felt a lot like that kid in high school who plays football really well and all the colleges are trying to rope him in.
Trying to get recruited.
Yeah, and then I went back to Publishers Marketplace again, looked at all their stats, tried to compare this one to that one, talked to all of them on the phone. I called a lot of their authors and spoke to their authors to, just to get the real scoop on what they were really like to deal with and things like that. And I found one that I really liked. I had a hard time talking to her, and I don't want to throw any names out there, but she was a phenomenal agent in New York. She's got a bunch of New York Times bestsellers authors that she represents. Great track record, but every time I hung up the phone with her, I felt like I just came out of the principal's office. Like I just got scolded for something. And I started thinking, like, do I really want to spend the rest of my life, talking to this person? I mean, she may do a lot of stuff for me from a career standpoint, but like I'm almost shaking, hanging up the phone with her. Like, I don't know that I want that relationship.
No, you can't underestimate that. I think that personal connection is really important, and it's something you sense on a gut level. It's not really something intellectual or financial.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was an idiot, and I went ahead and called her and told her I was going to go with her. And this was a Sunday, I think about 4:00 in the afternoon. Because she called when we spoke on Friday, and she received a copy of Fourth Monkey on Friday, and she read it over the weekend. She like dropped everything and read it, and she called me like Sunday afternoon, like around 2 or 3 or something, and she's like, "I have to represent you on this book." And I said, "Okay, well, let's do it." And then like an hour or two later, I get a call from Kristen Nelson, and she's like, I've been thinking about this book all week long. I know I told you I can't rep it because it's a thriller, but I need to rep this book. So I had already committed to the other agent, and now I've got the agent that I actually want on the phone telling me that, she wants to represent it. So I had to call the first one back and basically tell her that I'm going with somebody else. So that created some animosity. But Kristen has been phenomenal, and the agent author relationship is, you can't understate it. I speak to Kristen as much as I talk to my wife. You have to have a good dialogue. You have to understand each other. And she's just, she's cutting edge in a lot of different ways. She understands what's going on in the self-publishing world and what's going on in the traditional world. And she's fine with allowing her authors to walk the line between them. And I'm really doing that now. Like Fourth Monkey was traditionally published. I couldn't even tell you how many different publishers are on that book at this point, but it's about 24 different countries, or languages, I mean, and who knows how many different countries based on that. But she did a couple book deal for me with that. But then with my latest book, The Sixth Wicked Child, I didn't have a contract on that one. So we went back to the publisher that had published the first 2 books in the series. I literally ended the second book with "to be concluded." So everybody knew there was going to be a third book, but there was no contract for that third book. So the publisher made me a really strong offer on it, for U.S. English rights. And I turned it down. And I went to Kristen and I said, "Listen, like I'm comfortable self-publishing this book in all the English-speaking territories, but what I'd like you to help out with is what you've done on the foreign side. If I publish it in the US and UK and Canada, places like that, can you still sell it in all these foreign territories?" And it was an experiment. I wanted to see what would happen, and it worked out really, really well. I ended up doing the self-publishing thing for US, UK, Canada, and all the English territories, and the book is sold in pretty much all the other countries that my other books from that series sold in. So it's a mix. I've got HarperCollins and Random House and people like that putting it out overseas, but I still have the self-published side over here. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of this is going. It's all, it's like a tool in your toolbox. Is the traditional publisher going to be the tool that you need for this particular book? And they can bring a lot of things to the table that you still can't do on your own. Getting into a bookstore is very possible as a self-published author. I mean, Forsaken, I just saw it the other day at the Seattle Airport bookstore. It's still a self-published title. When you start selling enough copies, everybody starts picking it up. But you do have to make it available through certain sources. There's Baker and Taylor, Ingram Spark. There's ways to get those things done that a lot of indie authors tend to overlook. So I think if you're going to do the indie route, again, going back to what I had said earlier, you need to do it on a level where your book can't be distinguished from a book coming out of Random House. And that's probably the best advice I can give any indie author. Don't leave money on the table. Put out an audiobook, put out a hardcover, put out a mass market paperback, follow the same release schedule that they would. And you'll be surprised what kind of results you get.
Well, that's a really interesting observation. And I want to kind of poke into that a little bit, because you have a long history of being sort of an entrepreneur or a business person. And I'm wondering if you have sort of a high level of approach to business or an ethos, or, how do you approach this whole thing? Because I think a lot of writers, especially inexperienced writers, think that, well, you just go off in a cabin and you type on a typewriter or a laptop, and then you hand it to someone and you just get money. But I don't think that's necessarily how it works. So what is your approach to the business of writing?
I don't know that it's ever worked that way. And I talked to Koontz one time. He sent me an email and he said, I'm in the middle of signing 40,000 book plates. It took him about 2 weeks to do. And he tends to listen to a lot of music as he does these things. And he was listening to, I think it was the Graceland album from Paul Simon. But for like the last 10,000 that he signed, he listened to the same song over and over again. But
that's brutal.
This is but it's Dean Koontz, and he's doing the same thing that I was doing like a week before. I wasn't signing 40,000 of them, but I was signing book plates. And all these big name authors, they all do that still. They still put in the work. I think what happens is people, like if a writer is in a movie or a TV show, they create this particular character that has, Pierce Brosnan sitting in a little attic room, typing away and turning out page after page. And he's got the nice little stack of papers next to him. When he's done, he hands it off to his agent, who vanishes until those pages are done. Like the agent's not even on the phone with him kicking his butt and getting it done. But he hands it off and the book goes off to his editor, and then he spends the next, 9 months or whatever doing something different. It doesn't work that way. Like you have to put your butt to the grindstone. Writing the book is the easy part to me. Like you have to create the perfect book from the get-go. It's got to be a 5-star book. Cause in the end, you're creating a product. And I think it's important that authors actually realize that you're creating a product that somebody out there has to buy. And, you need that product to be as perfect as possible. So you need to knock off all those things and tick off those boxes. But I've seen a lot of people, they kind of, get up on their soapbox and I don't want to edit. I don't want to do this. I don't want to change that. This is the story I want to tell. And that's all cool, but it depends what your audience is going to be. Like if you're, in my world, I'm shooting for mass market. I want as many possible people to pick up my book and buy it as I can. And in order to do that, I've got to satisfy the widest net of people. So I try to do that. I purposely keep stories that are fresh, but also accessible to everybody. I think about those things before I actually start writing a book. If I wanted to write an Amish steampunk novel, if I had that in the back of my head, I'd say, well, I can write it, but the 12 people that are going to buy it, is that going to really, be worth the 3 months I'm going to put into it?
Probably more like 10, but 12.
Yeah, maybe 10, but these are thoughts that I tend to have at the get go. I mean, like right now, like I'm working on spec now with publishers, which is weird. Like, so instead of turning in a finished book, like I gave my editor a PDF that was probably about 10 pages long, and it had the back of book blurbs for ideas of books that I want to write. So about 1 or 2 paragraphs for different ideas. And I said, we basically told them, JD's willing to write any of these. Which one do you think is going to be the one you can market the best? A year and a half from now, because they don't put them out as fast as indie authors do. There's a good 1.5 to 2 year lag time. So that's kind of how I've been working now. They've been picking the ideas from my little, list of, stories that I want to write. And I just kind of sit down and write those stories. So it's changed. It evolves a little bit.
What are some of the things that you still do on either a daily or a weekly basis that would surprise us?
I still use copy editors. I still have beta readers. I still have alpha readers. I go through that entire process, and I go through a copy edit before my agent sees a book. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the things that I learned in working with agents and editors back in the book doctor days is, if you go back 20 or 30 years, editors had time to take on a project. If they liked a book enough, they would take it on, and they'd find the time in their schedule to tweak it and help that author get it done. But in today's world, they don't have that time. They've got a stack on their desk of just boatloads of work. And they don't have the extra, couple hours a day to be able to put into something. So I found that if you get a book as perfect as possible before an agent gets it, before an editor gets it, it does 2 things for you. That editor is going to pay a lot of more money for that book, just because they know that they don't have to put any, real time into tweaking it. And then also when you start getting edits back from that editor, there's very little that has to change. They're moving a couple commas around, maybe they want to change this sentence or drop this particular paragraph, but there's none of the big wholesale changes that you would see on a book that would be considered a project. You're not going back doing a complete rewrite. You're not moving this chapter or taking this chapter out, or putting 10,000 words in here. None of those things happen.
Right.
And that's important to me because as you're writing the book, all these things are totally in your hands. Until you actually show it to somebody else, it's your book. You can do whatever you want with it. But the second you sell it to one of the big publishers, or an editor comes on board, now you've got your agent weighing in with changes. You've got your editor weighing in with changes. You've got the marketing people at the publisher's house telling you what needs to be changed. Like this lead character's name should be this because that tests better than the name you're using now. We don't like your title. We would rather use this, things like that. So, I try to field as many of those problems before it even gets to that point and try to whittle them out. Dracul is a good example of that. Random House, it was GP Putnam Random House. They put out the book. They wanted to change the title on it. They felt that Dracul would be a problem because people would think it's Dracula. They were worried what would happen if somebody went on Google and started typing in Dracul. Dracula comes up. But what they didn't realize, the same thing happens with Amazon or did happen. What they didn't realize is the opposite effect happens when you actually put out a book called Dracul. When people start typing in Dracula, Dracul comes up first. And I told them I'm perfectly happy, changing the name if they can come up with a name better than Dracul, because Dracul conveyed a lot of information. You saw that name, you knew it was immediately related to the Dracula family.
Right.
It's not quite Dracula, so you know that it's something different. So subconsciously that communicated a lot of information, and that's not something that I came up, upon on my own. I tested, friends and family. I tested, groups. I do a lot of market research before I put anything out, to figure out what floats and what doesn't. Even with my name, my full name is Jonathan Dylan Barker. I put a post out before Forsaken came out and said, well, if you had to buy a book based solely on the author's name, which name would you choose? And I had Jonathan Dylan Barker. I had Jonathan Dylan. I had JD Barker. I had Jonathan Barker. I had every variation of my name up there. And JD Barker got 80% of the votes. So that's what I went with. And I tend to approach all this that way. No different than, a cereal company putting out a new breakfast cereal. They're going to test it. They're going to make sure that it floats before they spend the big money. And I try to do that with my books.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is, I think this is a great start to our new podcast here. And maybe one way we can kind of wrap up this conversation is I'd like to know what you think is on the near horizon for publishing. What are you excited about? What are you looking towards that might not necessarily be sort of fully embraced right now, but it's on that near horizon?
Wow. It's changing so fast. That's kind of a loaded question. But the one thing that I've been watching extremely close, is called the Espresso book printing machine. This is a machine that's roughly about the size of a desk, and you can print any paperback book that's in its catalog in about 5 minutes. Full color cover. It looks no different than a book coming out of KDP or a paperback you might pick up in the store. And I think that's honestly going to be a game changer if they can get the cost down, because you take a small little independent mom and pop bookstore, they throw this in the middle of their floor, and all of a sudden they've got every book, and they can get it to you within 5 minutes. That's faster than Amazon. That's a game changer.
Yeah.
But at the point right now, the cost on that device is just too prohibitive. It's about $100,000 to put that machine in a bookstore, and nobody can afford it. There's Shakespeare and Company in New York, and they've got, I think, 2 or 3 locations that have those in there. There's another bookstore in Pittsburgh that has one. So they're slowly rolling out, and there's people testing that, but they haven't quite embraced it yet. And the other thing that I found is, the catalog that's available, it's fed by Ingram Spark, which is one of the big distributors out there. Not all the big publishers are on board with it. So I've got books with kind of everybody at this point. So it's got every one of my self-published titles in the catalog, but my books that are with Random House aren't in there because Random House doesn't want to sign on the dotted line to make their books available in this system. So for indie authors right now, it's actually, it's something I think they should be embracing. But we'll see. All it's going to take is somebody to come up with a leasing model, make it cheap enough for people to be able to put it out there in their stores. And it could be a game changer. Who knows?
I could even imagine that being a big game changer at things like airport bookstores and malls and places like that where there's high traffic. Those machines could be cranking out books almost constantly.
Yeah, well, it's like a red box for books, right?
Yeah.
So you put it in the terminal at the airport and people can get whatever book they want, just like that. And I don't know how good that is for the airport bookstore.
Yeah, right.
But it's, technology tends to drive the way the consumer operates. And I see that as a leader at some point in the future. It's not quite there yet, but it's close.
Excellent. Well, man, this has been a blast. I'm so glad this is only one of many to come.
Yeah, I can't wait. We're going to have so much fun doing this.
Yeah, we're going to have we've already got a bunch of guests lined up. We've got some recorded. We're not going to tease them just yet because we don't know what the order is going to be on the release, but it's all going to be coming really soon. We're really excited about it, and I look forward to working with you on this.
Yeah, you too. I can't wait.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Writers Inc. Access the show notes and leave a comment at writersincpodcast.com.